Rejection is a death sentence to a werewolf. It breaks the mind and shatters the soul. But when the future alpha of the Silverpine pack severed their bond in front of hundreds, she didn't weep. She smiled, and that smile was the beginning of an empire's ruin. The great hall of Oakwood was suffocatingly warm, thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced mead, and the nervous pheromones of 300 wolves. It was the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred evening in the medieval werewolf calendar. Tapestries depicting ancient hunts hung from the stone walls, catching the flickering light of the massive hearths. This was the night the moon goddess was said to walk among her children, tying the invisible, unbreakable red strings of fate between destined mates. For Isolde, the night was nothing more than another grueling shift. Orphaned by the border wars when she was barely a pup, Isolde was tolerated in the Silverpine pack only for her unparalleled skills as an herbalist. She possessed no noble blood, no wealth, and no status. While the high-born daughters of neighbouring packs preened in their silks and velvets, Isolde stood near the shadows of the servants' corridor, her simple wool dress smelling faintly of yarrow and crushed pine needles. She was merely there to ensure the elder wolves' goblets never ran dry. At the centre of the hall stood Conrad. He was the future alpha of Silverpine, a young man of broad shoulders, striking golden eyes, and an ambition that bordered on ruthlessness. For months, it had been an open secret that his father, Lord Sterling, had brokered an alliance with the wealthy Riverlands pack. Tonight, Conrad was expected to formally announce his courtship of Sibylla, the Riverlands' haughty, jewel-draped daughter. Then, the clock chimed midnight. The air in the hall suddenly shifted. A heavy, electric pressure dropped over the room, silencing the bard's lutes and the boisterous laughter. The mating pull had begun. Isolde gasped, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the silver pitcher she was holding. A scent hit her like a physical blow, a heady, intoxicating blend of wood smoke, frost, and old leather. It bypassed her rational mind, sinking straight into the primal core of her wolf. Her chest tight, she looked up, her eyes scanning the sea of bodies. They locked onto Conrad. Conrad had frozen mid-step, his golden eyes wide and blown black with sudden, overwhelming desire. He was staring directly at the shadowed corner where Isolde stood. The invisible string had snapped taut between them. The entire pack felt the resonance of the bond. It was an undeniable, raw magic that hummed in the marrow of their bones. The orphan healer and the future alpha were fated. A murmur rippled through the hall. Sibylla's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure venom as she realized her prized political marriage was unraveling before her very eyes. Conrad's breathing turned ragged. He took a step toward Isolde, his wolf clawing at his mind, demanding he cross the room, drag her into his arms, and mark her as his own. Isolde stepped out of the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent her life invisible, unloved, a ghost in her own home. Now, the goddess had gifted her a mate. She looked at Conrad, her eyes softening, a tentative hope blooming in her chest. But as Conrad closed the distance, the primal haze in his eyes began to clear, replaced by the cold, calculating glint of ambition. He looked at Isolde's rough, work-worn hands. He looked at her plain dress. Then, he looked at his father, Lord Sterling, whose face was purple with silent, threatening rage. Lastly, his eyes flicked to Sibylla, and the immense dowry of land and soldiers she represented. Conrad stopped 10 paces from Isolde. The silence in the great hall was absolute. You could hear the crackle of the logs in the fire. Isolde, Conrad's voice rang out, loud and devoid of warmth. Isolde froze. The tone was wrong. There was no reverence, no submission to the bond. I am the future alpha of the Silverpine, Conrad declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling. My duty is to the strength and prosperity of my people. I will not tether my bloodline to a nameless, rankless servant. A collective gasp swept through the nobility. Rejecting a fated mate was a blasphemy of the highest order. It was known to drive wolves to madness, to feral grief. Conrad squared his jaw, his eyes cold as he looked down at her. I, Conrad of the Silverpine, formally and absolutely reject you, Isolde, as my fated mate. The words were a physical blade. When a bond is severed, the spiritual backlash is agonizing. Isolde fell to her knees as an excruciating, tearing pain ripped through her chest, right where her heart beat. It felt as though her ribs were being cracked open, her very soul being surgically excised without anesthetic. A choked sound escaped her throat. Conrad looked away, feigning indifference, though a slight grimace betrayed his own pain. He reached out and took Sibylla's hand. The pack waited for the inevitable. They waited for Isolde to scream, to beg, to collapse into a puddle of broken, sobbing devastation. They waited for her wolf to howl in the unbearable agony of rejection. Isolde stared at the stone floor, her vision swimming in grey static. The pain was monumental, a roaring ocean trying to drown her, but as she looked at Conrad's polished boots standing next to Sibylla's silk slippers, a profound clarity pierced through the agony. He was weak. The moon goddess had offered him a true equal, a soul perfectly mirrored to his own, and he had traded it for gold coins and political favour. He was not a king, he was a coward. The realization extinguished the fire in her chest, replacing it with a freezing, unyielding iron. Her wolf didn't whimper. It bared its teeth in silent, absolute contempt. Slowly, Isolde pushed herself up from the floor. She stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of her simple wool dress. She looked Conrad dead in the eyes. And then, she smiled. It was not a hysterical smile, nor a forced, brave grimace. It was a serene, pitying, breathtakingly beautiful smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just realized she had dodged a blade in the dark. Isolde, she said, her voice smooth as glass, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the dead silent hall. Accept your rejection, Conrad. May you find exactly what you are worth. She did not shed a single tear. She turned on her heel, her posture impeccable, and walked out of the great hall, leaving a heavy, suffocating unease in her wake. Conrad stared after her, the rotting sensation of a dead bond settling in his gut, deeply unnerved by the fact that he felt he had just lost something far more valuable than a crown. 3 weeks passed since the winter solstice. The Silverpine pack was a hive of nervous whispers. According to law, a rejected female of low status should have wasted away, her coat turning dull, her eyes losing their light until she wandered into the winter woods to let the frost take her. But Isolde did not break. If anything, she thrived. She worked in her apothecary with a sharp, focused intensity. Her spine was always straight, her gaze clear and unwavering. Her resilience became a mirror reflecting Conrad's shame. Every time he walked through the courtyard with Sibylla on his arm, catching sight of Isolde calmly grinding herbs or carrying water, the severed bond ached like a phantom limb. Sibylla, sensing his distraction, grew increasingly cruel. She would go out of her way to order Isolde to perform the most menial, degrading tasks, scrubbing the kennel floors, washing the muddy boots of the guards. Isolde performed every task with that same infuriatingly serene smile, never offering them the satisfaction of a complaint or a tear. But the petty dramas of the Silverpine pack were about to be eclipsed by a shadow that covered the entire continent. Word arrived via breathless ravens. Alpha King Alistair of the Ironclad Crown was making a progress through the Northern Territories, and Stonehaven Keep was on his immediate route. King Alistair was not merely a ruler, he was a living myth. A century ago, the werewolf realms were fractured, bleeding out in endless, savage territorial wars. Alistair had emerged from the brutal fighting pits of the far north. He was a warlord of unmatched ferocity and brilliant tactical mind. He had crushed the warring alphas, forced them to bend the knee, and united the packs under his absolute, terrifying rule. He was known as the Crimson Wolf. He was ancient, powerful, and mateless. Panic seized Lord Stirling and Conrad. The king's visits were not social calls, they were inspections. If a pack was found weak, corrupt, or poorly managed, Alistair was known to strip alphas of their titles, and sometimes their heads. Conrad saw this as his ultimate test. If he could impress the king with his military readiness and his wealthy new alliance with Sibylla, Alistair might grant him the alpha title early, cementing his power. For 7 days, Stonehaven Keep was scrubbed raw, banners were hung, feasts were prepared, and the finest armor was polished. When the king's retinue finally arrived, the very earth seemed to tremble. There were no grand carriages, only a vanguard of 50 massive, battle-scarred wolves, their coats black as pitch. They shifted seamlessly into hulking warriors, dressed in dark steel and boiled leather. And then came Alistair. When he dismounted his massive warhorse, the air in the courtyard seemed to thin. He stood a full head taller than Conrad, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a cloak of dire bear fur. His face was ruggedly handsome, aristocratic, but marred by a pale, jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a testament to battles fought on the front lines, not from behind a desk. His eyes were the colour of a stormy sea, sharp, calculating, and cold. Lord Stirling and Conrad immediately dropped to their knees, exposing their necks in deep submission. Sibylla fluttered down into a low, trembling curtsy. "Rise." Alistair's voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It held no anger, only an absolute, crushing authority. That evening, a grand banquet was held in the king's honour. The high table groaned under the weight of roasted boars, pheasants, and rivers of imported wine. Conrad sat near the king, sweating profusely as he boasted about his border patrols and his upcoming mating to Sibylla, desperately trying to fill the oppressive silence Alistair naturally commanded. The king barely touched his food. He looked profoundly bored, his slate-grey eyes scanning the room with the detached apathy of a predator watching ants scurry. Sibylla, eager to show off her dominance in front of the king, spotted Isolde standing quietly by the serving doors. "You there, servant," Sibylla snapped, her voice carrying over the music. Isolde, wearing a worn grey dress, picked up a fresh pitcher of wine and a cloth. She walked toward the high table, her face an unreadable mask. She knelt gracefully at Sibylla's feet, wiping away the wine the noblewoman had intentionally tipped onto the stone floor. Alistair had been staring out the window, ignoring Conrad's prattle. But as Isolde approached the dais, the king went perfectly, unnaturally still. His nostrils flared. Beneath the overwhelming stench of roasted meat, cheap perfume, and Conrad's nervous sweat, a scent broke through. It was incredibly faint, masked by ash and medicinal herbs, but to the Alpha King's heightened senses, it roared like a thunderclap. It smelled of ozone, wild rain, and something fundamentally, anciently, his. Alistair slowly turned his head. His stormy eyes locked onto the kneeling woman in the servant's dress. He saw the faded, scarred spiritual aura around her, the unmistakable mark of a severed mating bond. But beneath that scar, he saw a soul made of tempered steel. He felt the terrifying, world-shifting click of the moon goddess's ultimate design. After 100 years of ruling in darkness, the king had found his queen. Isolde rose, pitcher in hand, and as she stepped back from Sibylla, her eyes accidentally met Alistair's. The goblet in the king's hand shattered. The thick silver crumpled like paper under his sudden, involuntary grip, dark red wine spilling over his knuckles like blood. The music slammed to a halt. The chatter died instantly. 300 wolves held their breath as the Alpha King stood up. His immense, terrifying aura exploded outward, forcing every wolf in the room, including Lord Stirling and Conrad, to their knees in an instant, paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of his dominance. Everyone dropped, everyone except Isolde. Alistair stepped down from the dais, his eyes never leaving hers, the silence in the hall absolute and deafening as the king of all wolves walked toward the woman they had thrown away. The silence in the great hall was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating avalanche. The pressure radiating from Alpha King Alistair pinned 300 wolves to the stone floor. Lords, ladies, and fierce warriors alike were pressed flat, their foreheads touching the cold stone, their wolves whimpering in primal submission. Only Isolde remained standing. She stood frozen by the serving doors, the damp cloth still in her hand. The air around her crackled with an electric charge, smelling sharply of ozone, rain-lashed pines, and an ancient, territorial power. As the king approached her, every step he took seemed to echo like a war drum. Alistair stopped inches from her. Up close, the jagged scar on his face made him look dangerous, predatory, but his slate-grey eyes, which had looked upon the hall with such cold apathy moments before, were entirely undone. They searched her face with a frantic, disbelieving reverence. For a century, the Crimson Wolf had ruled alone, believing the moon goddess had deemed him too monstrous to be blessed with a mate. Yet here she was. Slowly, as if afraid she might shatter, Alistair raised a massive, calloused hand. He didn't demand. He asked silently. Isolde, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, leaned into his touch. The moment his skin met her cheek, a shockwave tore through the room. It was not the painful, agonizing snap of her bond with Conrad. This was an explosion of golden, blinding warmth. Isolde's wolf, which had been curled into a tight, defensive ball of iron since the winter solstice, suddenly uncoiled, singing a song of pure, triumphant homecoming. The red string of fate that Conrad had so callously severed was nothing compared to this. This was a soul tether forged in the stars. Alistair inhaled sharply, closing his eyes as the bond settled into his marrow. But as his heightened senses swept over her aura, his expression changed. The profound peace on his face fractured, replaced by a storm of apocalyptic fury. He felt the scar. He felt the jagged, rotting spiritual wound of a recently severed mating bond lingering on her soul. Alistair's eyes snapped open, blazing with a terrifying, unholy light. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the grovelling masses until it landed on the high table. "Commander Wyatt." Alistair's voice was a lethal whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast hall. From the shadows, a towering wolf in dark steel armor rose to one knee, unaffected by the king's crushing aura. "My king, force them to look at me," Alistair commanded. Wyatt strode forward, grabbing Lord Stirling by the collar and hoisting him up, while another royal guard yanked Conrad to his knees. Sibylla sobbed in terror, her face smeared with makeup, her mother, Lady Beatrice, trembling beside her. "Who did this?" Alistair asked. The temperature in the room plummeted. The fires in the hearths flickered and dimmed, choked by the king's suffocating rage. He gently traced his thumb over the invisible scar over Isolde's heart. "Who dared to reject my queen?" Conrad's face drained of all colour, turning a sickly, ashen grey. His lungs seized. The woman he had discarded to scrub floors and endure Sibylla's petty cruelty was the true mate of the Alpha King. The realization crashed into him with the force of a falling portcullis. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a cosmic, unforgivable sin. Lord Stirling, desperate to save his bloodline, stammered, "Your Majesty, there was a misunderstanding. A foolish, youthful error. My son—" "Silence." Alistair cut him off, the word hitting Stirling like a physical blow. The king stepped away from Isolde, though he kept one hand firmly wrapped around hers, a protective barrier between her and the pack that had abused her. He looked down at Conrad. The young heir was shaking violently, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "You," Alistair sneered, his voice dripping with venomous disgust. "You felt the blessing of the moon goddess, the highest honour our kind can receive, and you cast it aside." Alistair's gaze flicked to Sibylla, taking in her ostentatious jewels and trembling, cowardly posture. "And for what? A few acres of fertile land and a chest of silver? You traded a diamond for a handful of dirt. I did not know her lineage, my king," Conrad choked out, his voice cracking. "She was a nameless orphan." Before Conrad could finish, Alistair moved with blinding speed. He didn't shift, but his hand shot out, wrapping around Conrad's throat and lifting the broad-shouldered werewolf entirely off the ground. Conrad gasped, clawing at the king's impenetrable grip. "Her lineage is that she is mine," Alistair roared, his voice layered with the terrifying double timbre of his wolf. "She requires no name, no land, no dowry, because she is the other half of my soul. But you, Conrad of the Silver Pine, you have shown me the exact measure of your worth." Alistair dropped him. Conrad collapsed onto the stone, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. "I came to the Northern Territories to inspect the strength of my borders." Alistair addressed the terrified hall. "I expected to find warriors. Instead, I find a den of weak, pathetic cowards who value coin over the sacred laws of our kind. A pack that allows its future alpha to reject his mate and treat her as a slave." Alistair turned back to Isolde. The fury in his eyes instantly melted into profound devotion. He dropped to one knee, the king of the continent, kneeling before a servant in a stained wool dress. "Isolde," he said, his voice rich and steady. "I, Alistair of the ironclad crown, offer you my life, my armies, and my throne. You will never know a day of invisibility again. Will you accept me as your mate?" Isolde looked at the man before her. She looked at his scars, the undeniable power he wielded, and the absolute gentleness he reserved only for her. Then she looked past him, locking eyes with Conrad, who was watching his entire future disintegrate. Once again, Isolde did not cry. She smiled, but this time it was a smile of pure, radiant triumph. "I accept," she whispered. The departure of the Alpha King was as swift as it was devastating. He did not stay another night in Stonehaven Keep. He wrapped Isolde in his own dire-bear cloak, lifting her onto his massive warhorse. Before riding out, Commander Wyatt nailed a royal decree to the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall. The decree stripped Lord Stirling of his lands, halving the Silver Pine territory and reallocating it to the crown. Conrad was permanently barred from ever holding an alpha title. He was officially demoted to the rank of an Omega, the lowest tier of werewolf society, destined to serve the very people he had once commanded. Sibylla's family, humiliated and terrified of the king's wrath, broke the alliance, leaving Silverpine destitute and disgraced. But for Isolde, life transformed into something out of a forgotten legend. The royal capital, ironclad, was a breathtaking citadel of black stone and gleaming marble, nestled in the heart of the soaring Dragontooth Mountains. From the moment she arrived, she was treated not just as a mate, but as a deity. The finest silks, spun in the southern ports, replaced her scratchy wool. Royal physicians tended to the exhaustion in her bones, and Alistair, terrifying and ruthless to his enemies, was endlessly patient and gentle with her, helping her heal from the years of emotional starvation. Yet, Isolde was not content to merely sit on a throne. She was an intellectual, a healer, and a survivor. With Alistair's blessing, she immersed herself in the royal archives, working alongside the king's chief historian, Scholar Arthur. Isolde was driven by a lingering curiosity about her parents, who had perished in the border wars over 2 decades ago. All she had ever been told by the Silverpine elders was that they were low-born rogues. It was on a rainy Tuesday, 3 months after her arrival at Ironclad, that Scholar Arthur discovered the truth buried in a dusty, sealed vault of census records from the year 1042. "My queen!" Arthur gasped, rushing into her private study, unrolling a brittle parchment across her oak desk. "Your parents were not rogues, and they were certainly not low-born." Isolde leaned over the map. Her eyes traced the faded ink. Her father's true name was Lord Arthur Blackwood. Her mother was Lady Eleanor Blackwood. They were the original, rightful rulers of the Riverlands, the very territory that Sibylla's family, House Arrington, claimed as their own. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. House Arrington had not legally acquired the wealthy river territories. During the chaos of the border wars, Sibylla's grandfather had betrayed the Blackwoods, orchestrating their assassination to steal their lands and their immense wealth. Isolde had been hidden by a loyal servant and smuggled across the border to Silverpine, her identity erased to protect her from Arrington assassins. The bitter irony was almost poetic. Conrad had rejected Isolde to marry Sibylla for the Riverland's wealth that legally, historically, and rightfully belonged to Isolde herself. When Alistair learned of this treason, his retribution was cold, absolute, and merciless. He summoned the banners. The royal army marched north. There was no battle. There was only judgment. House Arrington was dragged in chains to the capital, their crimes of usurpation and murder laid bare before the council. They were stripped of all titles and wealth, exiled to the frozen wastelands beyond the northern wall. A year after the winter solstice that had broken her heart, Isolde returned to the north. She did not return as a servant. She rode at the head of a royal procession, wearing a crown of dark iron and intertwined silver branches. Alistair rode at her side, his presence a dark, protective shadow. They arrived at the newly reclaimed Riverlands estate, a sprawling, magnificent castle that dwarfed Stonehaven Keep. To formalize the transition of power, the neighboring packs were summoned to witness Isolde's ascension as the rightful Duchess of the Riverlands, on top of her title as Alpha Queen. Among the crowd of kneeling wolves was the Silverpine pack. Isolde sat upon the carved wooden throne in the center of the courtyard. She looked down at the masses. Near the back, scrubbing the mud from the cobblestones in a frayed, dirt-stained tunic, was Conrad. He was gaunt, the golden light completely dead in his eyes, his once proud shoulders permanently bowed by the weight of his Omega status and his catastrophic, ruinous regret. He paused his scrubbing and looked up. For a fleeting second, his eyes met Isolde's. She saw the agonizing realization in his gaze, the absolute certainty that his ambition had blinded him to the greatest treasure the goddess had ever crafted. He had traded a true queen for a thief, and in doing so, lost the world. Isolde did not gloat. She simply adjusted the crown upon her head, her hand slipping comfortably into Alistair's larger, warmer one. She looked away from Conrad, dismissing him from her mind entirely. Forever. She had an empire to rule, a mate who worshipped the ground she walked on, and a legacy to rebuild. The servant girl was dead. Long live the queen. Isolde's journey from a discarded servant to the most powerful queen in werewolf history remains a testament to absolute resilience. She didn't break when fate dealt a cruel hand. She stood tall, allowing karma to orchestrate its devastating symphony. The Silverpine pack learned too late that a woman's worth is not dictated by the men who fail to see it, but by the undeniable strength within her own unyielding soul.